Now, last time, if you remember, we started on characterization, and we covered two main points. One, the fact that characterization can be conveyed only by means of actions and words, in the same sense that it is only by means of their actions and words that you can observe the characters of other people in real life. I believe I mentioned that in characterization you can include narrative passages summing up the character's thoughts or feelings. But if you merely do that, that does not yet constitute characterization. A character of whom you will know nothing but the narrated inner thoughts or described feelings described by the author will not come across as a characterization. What is important, what are the main means of characterization, are actions, the actual things that a man does, and dialogue, the words which he speaks. The second point we covered last time was the essential difference between the naturalistic and the romantic method of characterization. And we established that the naturalistic method consists of presenting only what I called one layer, one onion skin of motivation, since all characterization does depend on clearly presenting the motives of a character. A naturalistic writer merely presents the immediate reason for the actions of a character, such as if a man seems to be unscrupulous about money, it's because he's greedy. Now that much would be presented and no more, whereas the romantic method of characterization would go deeper and indicate if a man is greedy, why, and perhaps even deeper to indicate what is the nature of greed. A romantic method goes down to fundamental abstractions, which does not mean to say, of course, that every romantic novelist does that, but that every romantic novelist goes as deep as his personal ambition or the seriousness of his subject requires. But the essence of the method is to present the essentials, the universals, motivating human action, whereas in a naturalistic form of characterization, only one or two immediate whys for human behavior are given, are illustrated very clearly. But beyond that, nothing is touched. That is, the fundamentals, the universals of human behavior are never touched, because that would be contrary to the naturalistic premise, contrary to the idea of free will. If men are determined, if they are what they are, there is no place in the philosophy of a naturalist for wide universal abstractions that govern human behavior, and particularly among which man has the power to choose. Now those were the two essential points that we covered last time. Today, I would like to read to you two scenes, one out of Arrowsmith and one out of the Fountainhead. I selected them because about the two nearest I could find that have resemblance to each other in general theme. It's the first meeting of Arrowsmith and Gottlieb, who is, if you remember, the old professor that he worships, and in Fountainhead, the first meeting of Rourke and Cameron. Since the Rourke and Cameron scene is much longer than the scene in Arrowsmith, we won't read all of the Fountainhead scene, but just the very beginning and the end. What I want you to watch for is the method and the nature of the characters, what you learn about the young men in Arrowsmith or in the Fountainhead, and about the older men. Now, if you remember, that's the scene in the university where Arrowsmith, who is then, I believe, just a freshman, or is that his second year, approaches Gottlieb, who is in fact, the eccentric old genius, the most brilliant and most unpopular professor in the school, and he wants to ask him to take his course ahead of time, which is not he's not supposed to do, but he would like very much. And this is the dialogue between them.
The first person who speaks is Professor Gottlieb. Well, yes? Oh, Professor Gottlieb, my name is Arrowsmith. I'm a medic, freshman, BA. I'd like awfully to take bacteriology this fall instead of next year. I've had a lot of chemistry. No, it is not time for you. Honest, I know I could do it now. There are two kinds of students that the gods give me. One kind they dump on me like a bushel of potatoes. I do not like potatoes, and the potatoes, they do not ever seem to have great affection for me. But I take them and teach them to kill patients. The other kind, they are very few. They seem for some reason that is not at all clear to me to wish a little bit to become scientists, to work with bugs and make mistakes. Those, I seize them. I denounce them. I teach them right away the ultimate lesson of science, which is to wait and doubt. Of the potatoes, I demand nothing. Of the foolish ones like you who think I can teach them something, I demand everything. No, you are too young, come back next year. But honestly, with my chemistry, have you taken physical chemistry? No, sir, but I did pretty well in organic. Organic chemistry. Puzzle chemistry. Stink chemistry. Drugstore chemistry. Physical chemistry is power. It is exactness. It is life. But organic chemistry, that is a trade for pot washers. No, you are too young. Come back in a year.
I love it. And we'll just take the beginning and the end of the scene. Remember that the content and purpose is not identical, but what I want you to watch for is characterization, since it's the first meeting of a young student and his best teacher.
Well, said Cameron at last, did you come to see me or did you come to look at pictures? Both, said Rourke. What do you want? Snapped Cameron. I should like to work for you, said Rourke quietly. The voice said, I should like to work for you. The tone of the voice said, I am going to work for you. Are you? Said Cameron. What's the matter? None of the bigger and better fellows will have you? I have not applied to anyone else. Why not? Do you think this is the easiest place to begin? Think anyone can walk in here without trouble? Do you know who I am? Yes, that's why I'm here. Who sent you? No one. Why the hell should you pick me? I think you know that.
I will skip the rest of the scene, which you probably remember, where he shows his drawings to Cameron, and take the conclusion.
God damn you, said Cameron softly. God damn you. I didn't ask you to come here. I don't need any draftsmen. There's nothing here to draft. I don't have enough work to keep myself and my men out of the Bowery mission. I don't want any fool visionary starving around here. I don't want the responsibility. I didn't ask for it. I never thought I'd see it again. I'm through with it. I was through with that many years ago. I'm perfectly happy with the drooling dolts I've got here. They never had anything and never will have, and it makes no difference what becomes of them. That's all I want. Why did you have to come here? You're setting up to ruin yourself. You know that, don't you? And I'll help you to do it. I don't want to see you. I don't like you. I don't like your face. You look like an insufferable egotist. You're impertinent. You're too sure of yourself. 20 years ago, I'd have punched your face with the greatest of pleasure. You're coming to work here tomorrow at 9 o'clock sharp. Yes, said Rourke, rising. $15 a week, that's all I can pay you. Yes. You're a damn fool. You should have gone to someone else. I'll kill you if you go to anyone else. What's your name? Howard Rourke. If you're late, I'll fire you. Yes. Rourke extended his hand for the drawings. Leave these here, bellowed Cameron. Now get out.
Who would like to comment?
Did you want to comment on the differences between the characters as they came across? Did you or did you?
No, at what came across, how much can you say about any of the four characters only from the scenes you just heard?
Oh, could I start this?
Yeah.
Well, I would say that there's a crucial glaring contrast between what comes across about both Arrowsmith and Gottlieb on the one hand and Rourke and Cameron on the other. And that pertains to the solemnity or certainty or seriousness with which they view their respective profession and the thing about which they're talking about. Because Arrowsmith conveys a kind of a boyish eagerness, which could, just from that scene alone, be in effect a temporary infatuation or some kind of youthful craze or whichever. And the illustration of that is, he in effect says over, gee, honest, I really am. And that whole gee, honest, gee whiz sort of style.
That is the essence of the style there, in this case, yes.
And the only statement, and Gottlieb also mocks himself when he says he doesn't know why they're interested in science, but in effect they are. So that what comes across is in effect that sort of a non-solemnity, a non-dignity about their attitude toward the particular field in question, either a kind of boyish eagerness without any profound depth to it, or a kind of a self-mockery. And the content is also very non-philosophical. I mean, the content of the scene pertains to whether or not organic chemistry is a sufficient prerequisite for biology. And that's about all that is factually discussed. Now, on the other hand, in the scene between Rourke and Cameron, you get sense on the part of both of them that this is a holy crusade and a very solemn affair. And there's certainly none of the self-mockery or boyishness or whichever. It's all extremely profound, and both of them are very certain of what they're talking about. Well, as an extraneous point, yours is 1,000 times more dramatic than the other one, but I would guess that's an extraneous comment. But
that's somewhat extraneous, except from a different viewpoint. I'll comment on that.
Also, yours is much more philosophical as a scene.
Tell me why.
Because people identify, in effect, what's going on. Like Cameron says here, an insufferable egotist. Now, that statement in that context identifies something about Rourke, which is in fact true, and which you may not have, a reader might not have explicitly formulated at this point, but which, when said, would see that it is correct, and in that sense would sort of retroactively identify what has been going on. That wasn't the only one. That was the only one that I took down, but I remember in passing that there were more comments. In the nature of the discussion, the meaning of it was communicated much more. But I can't think offhand of other lines, but that's what
I will comment later, but I want to say that I agree with everything you said. I will elaborate later. I think Kathy was next.
Well, one difference between the two scenes is that the Arrowsmith scene, as I remember, it had no description at all. It was only dialogue. And the dialogue was of such a nature that, although the two scenes were both scenes in which essentially a teacher recognized that a younger student had something of value, in the Rourke scene you could see why. Both from the physical descriptions and from the nature of the conversation. And in the Arrowsmith scene, you could not see why at all. You had to take it, you took it at his word for it, so to speak. Obviously, he would not have been speaking to this man this way if he didn't think. He wouldn't say, those I can teach like you, if he had not some reason for thinking this. But you had no reason for thinking this at all.
That is correct. Incidentally, that astonished me when I read the scene carefully. There is a description of the office and of Gottlieb preceding the scene. But no interruptions, no comments or descriptions during the dialogue. That is without, we read it without cuts. And there is no reason whatever why he says you are a good student or students like you I would like to teach. Nothing is indicated. Kathy?
I was going to say that in Gottlieb, the things that he says could be taken from quite a few points of view. He doesn't seem to value. You don't get any idea of what, any certain idea of which students he prefers to teach, what his evaluation is of these groups, but not.
Well, he does indicate. He says those who, for some reason, want to be scientists.
That this is the kind that he likes to teach?
Yes. That he said, but of course he didn't give any indication, nor did the scene as to how did he recognize those who wanted to be scientists. But at least he did indicate that he prefers the serious ones to what he calls the potatoes, meaning, I suppose, average boys who are not too serious.
Yeah, I was struck principally by the difference in the intensity of character and the intensity of involvement in the two sets of people. Arrowsmith simply wants to take a course. He wants to take it. Well, the intensity of his desire isn't extremely great. He says, "Gee, I'd like it. I really would, but this is how he said the top onion skin. Not getting why does he want to? Never really ever find out. He just plain likes Gottlieb. Gottlieb doesn't think he ought to take it because he doesn't have the prerequisites, although he likes him. Again, a simple statement, the top onion skin. But Cameron is working in this passage. You can see the struggle going on within Cameron. On one hand, here's someone whom he greatly wants to teach. On the other hand, he's trying to discourage him. He's trying to discourage this fellow from coming, and as he's trying to discourage him, he also at the same time wants him to come, and he's torn both ways, and it's certainly not the top onion skin.
I thank you for pointing it out, because it is peculiar that when you actually compare the two methods, it's the naturalistic ones who are just the kind of stark characters, which are graph professor, idealistic student, etc. And yet, literary critics, and I don't mean now only against me, but you must have read it about O. Henry and Hugo, and recently when they revived Sermon de Bergerac, I've seen comments of that kind from the drama critic about that. Of course, the characterizations are oversimplified and that they are just heroes and villains, or they would say about the Roar Cameron scene that is gruff old man and idealistic student. But in fact, it isn't. Yet, on the other hand, the naturalist has given you many more details, only they don't add up to any consistent depth. They become a floating abstraction, not an actual abstraction. By an actual abstraction, I mean common denominator derived from a certain group of concretes. And in that sense, Rourke and Cameron are actual abstractions of very profound issues. But the concretes which are shown indicate those issues. And that you'll find in Hugo, in Rostand, and all the better romanticists. But Arrowsmith, and yet this is one of the most romantic of Sinclair Lewis's novels. And Lewis is one of the better naturalists. So the method is the same with all of them, only, in fact, the flaws of the method are usually more apparent. It is precisely that wooden archetype that comes across, because the tiny little non-significant details nobody can retain. The journalistic details vanish, and the abstraction that comes across is just the first onion skin. It's a kind of gruff old man abstraction, although the total characterization will add up to more than that. But the atmosphere, that is your impression of how much do you know about the characters, remains on that level. They're over-detailed and never fully real. Now, I want to comment on the comments. I agree with every one of you. I mean, you've picked out the essentials. I just wanted to mention injustice to Lewis, that in the scene as written, one cannot tell whether the boy wants to work seriously or he just feels like at the moment. It's true and not quite true, but that's of course going outside the scene. If you remember the rest of the novel and what precedes the scene, Lewis has indicated in narrative that Arrowsmith was very interested in Gottlieb, and his interest in science as against the just commercial practice of medicine was indicated very long ago. But the trouble is that the method is exactly the same as you see in that scene. That is generalized narrative, which is mere assertion on the part of the author and does not really convince you of it. Now, the fact of how I selected to present their first meeting and how Lewis selected to present the first meeting are also significant. This is apart from characterization, it's more about the whole nature of approach of the naturalistic school or the romantic school. I think it was Leonard that said that the scene in the Fountainhead is more dramatic. Well, it is in a certain sense, but then it's not an accident that is the kind of scene I, as a romantic novelist, would have selected. Namely, the problem in both cases was the same. The relationship of a young student who is later going to be a brilliant scientist or a brilliant architect, the hero of the novel. His relationship to the particular teacher whom he has selected and who will influence him or give him the proper training. Now, it's not an accident, you see, that if I wanted to introduce the relationship of these two men, I would necessarily select a dramatic scene. I would select a scene which, in effect, would focus the relationship, the nature of their position in the world, and what is it that binds them together. Thus, if my purpose is to show that Cameron is a man of great genius and independence who is fighting against the world, he's fighting a losing battle, he's embittered, but he stands on his own standard, and Rourke is precisely that same type of man, sharing that kind of attitude towards his work, an independent, nonconformist, and the two meet. Then in order to illustrate the essence of that relationship, I will have them meet under circumstances which will not be casual or accidental, but which will dramatize in action the nature of their position in the world and of their relationship to each other. Now, Lewis has exactly the same problem, in essence, because Arrowsmith, although he's not a rebel in the sense Rourke is, in his own smaller naturalistic way, he is a rebel against the medical profession. Why I say smaller naturalistic, because as you observe, one of the methods of naturalism is never to stress anything, never to focus anything sharply. Whether Arrowsmith is a great genius or not, he is presented as if he's not. I don't think he's intended to be, although he's intended to be as an unusual man in science, or at least an unusual priest of science, a devoted one. Yet he's presented not only in his personal life, but even in his professional relationship, as you saw in the scene. He's presented on a kind of smaller scale, always on a dimmed or contradictory scale, almost as if the author deliberately is sticking feet of clay under him, when necessary or not, because that is the principle of the naturalist school, in effect. You cannot have a hero who is, in some kind of way, an exception. The hero has to be a statistical archetype. There has never been, incidentally, a study of a great man on the naturalistic school, or any man that might be presented as great, always will have the tragic flaw or the feat of clay of the human infirmity, will always have the undercutting touch, because again, that is the principle. By the standards of naturalism, a man cannot be an unusual exception. He has to be a human statistical archetype. Pardon?
He didn't leave any doubt as to what he was doing. He said specifically, I'm writing about someone who is in no sense a hero.
What did he say?
In the novel. At a fun place.
I'm writing about someone. Did he?
He said.
Lewis said that in the first person?
Yeah.
I missed that.
This narrative is about, this is a biography of someone who was in no way a hero.
Oh, that's possible. But I don't believe he, at least unless I missed it, and as I said, I didn't read the whole book carefully. I don't believe Lewis ever goes into the personal, the first pronoun.
Much better.
But the fact that he's not writing about a hero is overstressed all over, not only in narrative but in dialogue. And Leora, the heroine, who is a heroine, if I would classify her as an unusual woman, deliberately, time after time, if you remember, she declares to him, I'm only just plain folks. I am just an average woman. I'm not much.
Yeah.
Now, why I say heroine? Because she consistently is rational, direct, identifies reality, goes after what she wants, states her desire openly. In fact, I would classify her as a very good rationalist on a non-philosophical scale. She acts like one, and she's a very appealing, consistent character. At the number of times that issue of I am not anything unusual is thrown at you is almost embarrassing. And again, there, my guess would be that Lewis felt the exact opposite, that he rather liked this heroine properly, and was very busy assuring you that he was impersonal and standard of objectivity is don't think this is anything much.
Yeah.
Otherwise it wouldn't be naturalistic. Nothing that's very much exists. Incidentally, all this was an aside in the middle of one sentence that I had started. I don't know if anyone noticed it. And what led to the aside was that someone here smiled when I said the small naturalistic scale. So I felt obliged to explain exactly why I call it small scale. Now what I was saying is that on the naturalistic scale, Lewis had the same problem as I had in Fountainhead. That is the first meeting of two people who are going to be very important to one another, to each other in their lives, and who are supposed to be unusual characters in the sense, at least, that they're at war with their background. Don't follow the conventions, they rebel against the faculty and other students, they're more interested in science than in the kind of bavity that is shown to be prevalent among the faculty and the students. Now, it's precisely for the reason that we were just discussing about the deliberate, non-heroic scale that Lewis would not select a dramatic scene for their first meeting. After all, he was free not to have them meet in the most conventional way possible. That is, that the student comes asking for whether he can take a course. Any other number of meetings could have been devised. And it would be the deliberate intention, therefore not the flaw by their standards, but the virtue for a naturalist, to present a significant meeting as casually, unimportantly, and unobtrusively as possible. To bring it into sharp focus, to in effect say to the reader and the characters and lives, stop here, this is important, observe. That would be totally contrary to the naturalist tradition. Therefore, if you criticize Lewis for his scene being less dramatic than mine, that is true. But what it's an illustration of is the difference of standards. By a naturalist standard, my scene would be considered bad or unreal because it is too dramatic. By my standards, his scene is dull and casual and therefore undramatic. But you see, their answer to us, to the Romantic school, would be things don't happen in life so conveniently. They don't necessarily always happen dramatically. Therefore, their idea of presenting an event realistically is to make it casual and accidental. Now, of course, that point is philosophically debatable. To begin with, those things do not happen dramatically if the characters themselves are not dramatic and do not choose to make them happen. If the nature of the characters is such that they are independent and act on their own volition, then their meetings are never casual. That same scene, if by the requirements of the Fountainhead, if the two stories were reversed, at least in respect to this meeting, if I had Rourke approach Cameron as a student in the university asking for a special course, it would not be treated in the same manner as the Arrowsmith Gottlieb scene is treated. And on the other hand, if Lewis had to have a situation in which Arrowsmith comes to apply for a job in Gottlieb's laboratory, let's say, it would not be the dramatic, violent scene that you saw in the Fountainhead. And what I want you to realize is it's not an issue of which one is the better writer, because better here will depend on who has the right standards. What I want you to realize is that you're criticizing Lewis as a flaw for those things which he, as a naturalist, would take as a virtue. Only, since we don't have to tolerate every difference of opinion as equally valid, we could claim that we can prove why our viewpoint and our standard of value is more valid, more rational, when in fact the only one consistent with the proper view of literature or of any art. Now that's first as the general indication of the difference, why these two authors, by the nature of their approach to literature, would have selected to set up that first meeting in these two ways. Now, Leonard had commented on the fact that the Rourke Cameron scene is more philosophical. It's true, and it's not only because he calls Rourke egotistic, but because the emphasis in the Cameron speech is on the wider issue of their position. What he's talking about is simultaneously the concrete, is his own position and Rourke's position, and the wider issue, which is, in effect, we are both outcasts, we are going to have a terrible battle. I don't want you to suffer as I did, but you have no choice, and I won't let you go to anyone else. I won't let you sell yourself. That is what his speech is, in effect, stating. Although he's speaking about the particular problem between these two, he is stating the whole wider issue, which is the essence of their bond and of their fate throughout the book, their stand against society as individualists and nonconformists. On the Arrowsmith theme, you also have an indication of Gottlieb being a nonconformist and lonely, idealistic fighter. Also, that's indicated more in narrative preceding the scene. That is not quite indicated in the scene. But what is indicated is Gottlieb's bitterness, his contempt for the average, for the potato young man, and the fact that he's very eager for serious disciples. When he says, when I find the ones who want to be scientists, I pounce on them and I beat them, etc., but I teach them something. So that it is projected how strongly he feels about his science and how bitterly opposed he is to the conventional standards. But, as you indicate, the non-philosophical aura of that speech is the fact that he's talking in concrete that merely show that one abstraction of, well, he likes one type of students and he's bitter about the other, period. No wider implication, instead of the wider social implication, or the implications of the position of a fighter for science, the kind of implications that are very clear in Cameron's speech, because there he is openly saying we're victims of society and we're fighters for our art. Instead of the wider approach of Cameron's, what Lewis gives Gottlieb is those technical details, which again, from a naturalist standpoint, are what makes the scene real. From our standpoint, is what characterizes unmercifully. And that is the details about organic chemistry or some other kind of chemistry. Or I teach them to poison patients, or I teach them something else. In other words, the focus is on the minutiae of the particular profession. And can almost the self-conscious, but again, by their standards, deliberate indication of the technical details. You've got to be real, you've got to give the particulars. Now, Cameron at no time said, I will teach you to have corner windows rather than Greek pediments. But this is a naturalistic approach, would be said. Now, intensity of the scene, that again would be a deliberate kind of cardinal literary issue in the naturalistic school. You don't show authentic intensity. Certainly not in a sympathetic way. There are exceptions, of course, in other books. I mean, there can be scenes of great emotional intensity. But if you put me on the spot and ask me, can I name one of a naturalistic school in which the intensity is allowed to stand unchallenged, in which, in effect, characters are shown feeling very intensely, very passionately about something, and, in effect, being right? No, I can't think of such a thing. I can think of any number of scenes from naturalistic novels in which great passion or intensity is displayed, and it is always either mocked or undercut or shown to be foolish. The seriousness of a purpose allowed to stand is not a tenet of the naturalistic school. Now, I wouldn't want to make it an absolute, because I can claim to have read all of the naturalistic school of literature, which I avoid reading whenever I can after my original acquaintance with it. And also, no school, neither side, would always be faultlessly and automatically faithful to its basic principles. That is, departures and variations and contradictions are always possible. But I mean this as a general rule about the naturalist school, that is the rule which you observe most often, and the one which is logically consistent with their premise. You cannot show great intensity of passion about robots. To let a great emotional scene come across as intense, important, and right, in effect to stand unchallenged in the context, would be a contradiction. A determined being cannot be said. Only a free will being can be. If you have the freedom to choose your values, then you can have such an emotion as intensity or indifference to any given pursuit. But when you're determined, or you can have some passions, you can have some explosions, but none of it can be metaphysically important.
At this point, a student asked, wouldn't Shakespeare be an exception to that?
No, because observe, what does he do? Now that he shows violent passions, yes, like King Lear or Othello or Antony and Cleopatra or any of them. Now, which ones of them does he consider good and proper? Which ones are unchallenged and undefeated? They're always wrong. That is what I meant by the context. The naturalist will never allow his intense character to be right about his intensity.
Wouldn't there be another reason in that in order to permit a character to be intense and sanction it, you yourself would have to in some way be a moralist. That is, in order to be able to approve of that kind of
in a way.
And that therefore the anti-moralist approach of the naturalist would immediately recoil against any intense character who is right and would want to undercut it in some kind of way, because that would be an element out of a black and white moral universe, which is precisely what they're contesting in their literary approach.
That's right. Yes?
I think there are scenes of great emotional intensity of a negative sort. I don't know whether these would be metaphysically important or not, but I was thinking, for instance, of the very end of Farewell to Arms, when the girl has died. And the man it starts to rain and he remembers how much he nearly rained. I mean, it's a very straight scene, and you feel he meant it, and the author feels it's all right.
Or intensity of pain, or intensity of negatives, yes.
And also in the informant, there's a sort of scene at the funeral where he feels terribly guilty for having sold that movie. But I mean, I would consider it in the same...
Oh, it is a realistic, naturalistic movie, yes. No, the intensity of pain is projected very often, I think, on the ghastliest examples, I mean, well done, is the suicide of Anna Karenina, where her hopeless position and terror and the despair are marvelously conveyed. But you see that a naturalist does wonderfully. And I'm not sure that any romanticist does. Not with that complete intensity. Victor Hugo, for instance, who usually has unhappy endings, always present his suffering somewhat in a way that I present the ending of With the Living, which is, even if it's tragedy and pain at the moment, it's metaphysically not the final word on man. The pain is never complete, even if in the particular character it's disaster, but there isn't that overwhelming horror of pain that you find in the naturalist novels, and vice versa. When it's enjoyment or happiness or young love, is never going to stand unchallenged in a naturalistic novel.
Do you look on Dostoevsky as a naturalist or a romanticist?
He's in between, essentially a romanticist. In between, in only this sense that what he presents is strictly only the evils. He cannot succeed at presenting a hero, but he belongs to the romantic school on two counts. A, the plot structure. B, the extreme moralist attitude. That is, he presents men as creatures of free will. At no time does he indicate, even by implication, that his villains couldn't help it. He doesn't preach in what way they could help it, but the implication, the whole approach is this is the kind of depravity that men should not come to. It's always the should that's present in the whole manner of approach, and in that sense, it's a romantic. Now,
there was a part in Arrowsmith, which I interpreted somewhat differently than you did. you think that his discussion of organic chemistry or physical chemistry is getting bogged down in the naturalistic detail. But on the other hand, the reason he says he prefers physical chemistry shows something about the man's character, shows that he has a love of truth, of exactness, precision, and a love of discovering order in nature. Because what he likes in it is that it's, or whichever one you prefer, was that it was precise and measurable and so on.
Well, yes, but then the issue here, if it's the issue of his scientific spirit that was to be presented, I would, by romantic standards, prefer not to see it presented by this means. There are other means to present it, which would not consist of enumerating sciences from which, by implication, you can deduce that one science is more exact than another. I wouldn't say that this is necessarily bad if that was not all that there was in the scene. If the scene had been longer and fuller, then some of those details could be absorbed. And again, if the stress was put on what you mentioned, if that is the purpose, then if that point was made to come across, the number of concrete details that Lewis gives would then depend on the scale, if the essence is shown. But here, you can infer the essence. What is immediately shown is just this very precise medical dialogue. There is more technical dialogue about the sciences or the requirements for students than the essence of what those two characters are meeting about and what they stand for. That is the sense in which essence is cluttered with details. Now, here's what I wanted to call your attention to. The standard of selection of the whole naturalist or romantic school. For instance, if the naturalistic school claims that what it presents are normal or realistic events, that is, events as they can and do happen, then I would ask you this: are either of those two scenes normal daily events? No. Certainly the Rod Cameron scene is not, but neither is the Arrowsmith Gottlieb scene. In other words, it would not be a daily normal average occurrence for Gottlieb suddenly to make that kind of speech to a student, particularly, as Miss Taylor observed, when the students actually had not shown any particular reason why Gottlieb decided that he is a good student. But let us assume that something about his manner or sincerity projected this. It would still be an unusual occurrence for a professor to break down, in effect, to that extent and make that kind of speech. Now, I say that that is quite proper. But I say that from the romantic standpoint. That is, I say the purpose of fiction is to present the exceptional and not to present the daily catalog of that which is unexceptional or unnoticed. In this sense, then, the naturalist school is merely, in regard to this particular scene, it's merely middle of the road. It does just what the romantics do, but it apologizes for it, and it doesn't do it openly and fully. Now I'll ask you, in a sense of apology, what makes Gottlieb more realistic a character than Cameron, taking the two scenes? Now, certainly nobody would normally speak the way Cameron does, nor would the professor in Gottlieb's position speak the way he does at a student merely because he saw something promising in that student. You know, the touch which would make any admirer of the naturalist school consider Gottlieb realistic, but Cameron not. The touch of the ludicrous. The touch which you observed. Both men, Arrowsmith and Gottlieb, undercut their profession. But it's more clear, as Leonard mentioned, but clear in Gottlieb's speech, where he deliberately makes fun of himself, of the idealist, and of their whole devotion to science. More than that, the kind of words he's given is such things as, they dump students on me like potatoes, I don't like potatoes. Now, although the idea behind it is, they send me too many mediocrities, I don't like mediocrities. If a man of genius, as Gottlieb is supposed to be, talks of it in terms of potatoes, there is a slight touch of the vulgar, the ludicrous, the non-heroic. He is made human. That is his verbal fit of play. Any naturalist or admirer of naturalism reading this will say, yeah, that's real, that's human, because people do talk that way. Well, in fact, they do not talk that way. And Gottlieb isn't even supposed to be an average character. But what gives the naturalist readers the sense of the human or the possible or the average is precisely this undercutting of the clear cut, the purposeful, the heroic, or the unusual by means of the most deadly of all undercutting artistically, and that is humor. There is nothing that's going to make a great man ludicrous as the touch of humor at the wrong thing at the wrong time. I'd ask you here to note what has been done. It is precisely by using a homey, unromantic, unscientific, or unserious metaphor that the alleged reality of the man is conveyed. He's only human. He uses homey metaphors or projects a homey impression. That, in fact, is the difference stylistically between the two speeches, and why the naturalist would accept Gottlieb as realistic, but Cameron, oh no, nobody talks that way. Now, in fact, what they object to is not anything that Cameron would specifically say in that speech, but the fact that the speech is undiluted, direct, purposeful. He says what he says, and there's no apologies presented, no contradictions. When I say no contradiction, I mean in the basic attitude of the man toward existence. It's an embittered, self-righteous, heroic man, and that is what he is. Gottlieb is also an embittered, self-righteous, and intended heroic man. But he is homey and sarcastic in an undignified, unsound way. In those two speeches, in small, you can see the whole essence of the difference of approach of the two schools. Now, I ask you also this. Is Arrowsmith a natural character and is Rourke unnatural? Now, don't think of the rest of the novel, but just these two scenes, in the sense of, here is the presentation of a young man with a serious purpose, starting out on a serious career, and that's the intention in both cases. Now, I would submit that in realistic terms, Arrowsmith, as presented in the scene, is 10 times more unrealistic than Rourke and totally unnatural. For this reason, that if a young man comes in and says, oh gee, professor, I would like it very much, honest I could, I've taken a course, I would say that no young man ever acts that way. Because the young, particularly intelligent young, who have some purpose, even if not fully formed yet, as in Arrowsmith's case, but after all, he's a man who later on, with all kind of relapses, does follow a single line of a profession. He is a dedicated man. Well, young men of that kind are particularly solemn and formal, particularly in their late teens and early 20s. There is no time at which a young man will be, or anyone will be quite so pompous as in his first college years, if he's serious at all. So that if Lewis wanted to be naturalistic in the sense of really watching reality, he would present Arrowsmith in any kind of way, but not that way. That is not the picture of a serious young man approaching a professor for whom he feels great reverence. You know what this is? Is the statistical abstraction of a college kid, an average college kid. Lewis was drawing him precisely not as a man, but as an, again, statistical archetype. The atmosphere of collegiate dialogue, particularly of that period, would be exactly this. Oh, gee, honest I will, and the stammering embarrassment and the kind of non-serious enthusiasm. That it would be Lewis's abstraction of the college spirit, of boys in their 20s, but it would certainly not be his nor anybody's realistic picture of a serious young man. And I repeat, even if that young man might be bashful, not fully formed yet, not fully able to express himself, even though the shyer and more uncertain he is, the more pompous and formal he would be, not informal and OG honest, not that style. Now, if you ask me by what standard do I say that that is what serious young men are? Do I use the statistical method? No. The fact that it's logically so. In the logic of the development of a serious young mind, in his early 20s or late teens, when a young man is just forming his view of life, whatever he does, he is not going to be casual about it. That is in the nature of what we mean by a serious young mind and his quest for knowledge. And just as a tribute, strike it. Now look at Rourke. I know that any naturalist would say no young man of 22 could be that poised and that self-assured. That is, he comes to the man that he worships and very calmly says, I want to work for you, and in fact is implying, well, I'm going to work for you. That, a naturalist would say, is too much assurance for a young man that young. And my answer would first philosophically be that depends on what kind of young man and what kind of premises he's set himself. Depends on his state of knowledge and on his sub-basement. Leonard, whom I met at the age of 17, and who, as I later learned, was very much afraid of meeting me in the sense of which that Arrowsmith was supposed to feel towards Gottlieb, but the forms are not the way Lewis presented them. Namely, he was afraid in the sense of awe, and he was afraid to go in. Yet, when he came in, he was obviously ill at ease, but not in that kind of, not in the sense of foolishness. It was more in a sense of slight strain and tension, and I tried to ask him, well, how did you like the drive to the country, or a little small talk to let him relax. And it was he at 17 who said, well, let's get down to business. And he had a long list of philosophical questions he wanted to ask me. Now, that's what I would present if I were a naturalist. And you see, then, that would be a romantic novel. That is what I wanted to indicate to you, simply as factual material and as proof that the naturalistic method is not actually the method of transcribing that which the author literally observed. First, it would be bad if he did, nor can any author succeed at that. All art being necessarily a selection and an abstraction and a presentation of a certain view of life, what the naturalists do is present, as I said, the statistical average, not that which the actual characterization in fact and in reality should be. If Lewis had studied statistics, in effect, on talented young men, even by their method, he would not have presented him as he presents Arrowsmith. Now, so much for the conflict between the two schools and the essence of the method of characterization. Now, I want to go to characterization in general. This part of the lecture was about comparing the methods of the two schools, but our subject, after all, is characterization as such. Now, let me introduce it by explaining what my purpose is. What I want you to watch for here, and we'll discuss in the details later. I'll just give you the introduction in order to know what the example is intended for. I want you to watch the means by which characterization is done, the mechanics of projecting a character and of informing the reader about the nature of a character. Here I'm taking a scene from the Fountainhead, and this is not in the sense of watch for the romantic method versus the naturalistic. This is characterization as such, regardless of method. I mean, of course, my method would be romantic, but I am here concerned with not an issue of the methods of two different literary schools, but simply the essence of characterization as such. Now, I had prefaced these lectures, if you remember, by stressing to what extent you must remember, if you want to present a convincing characterization, that you can project your character only by means of what he does or says, that what the reader will know is only what you have said on paper. And that you have to be very careful about the implications of what you say and even of what you omit. When you write a character, remember that the reader will be constantly making observations and lightning like calculations about what premise does this action come from. What is the motive of a man who does this or that? Why does he say this? What does it show about him? Now, when I said the reader will be doing this, I mean that unfortunately, most readers will not be doing it consciously by analytical, rational terms. They will be doing it in effect, what by instinct. They will be doing it by wordless impression. But at the end of a chapter or a book, they will have a certain impression of a hero. And the accuracy of the impression will, of course, be in proportion to the degree of conscious rationality and perceptiveness with which the reader read, but to the extent to which any reader reads, if he reads at all, his impression of a character will be conveyed only by what you say. But behind every line or every action that you portray, there will be much more than what is on paper. By what means? By the fact of implication, by the fact that no action is ever taken in a vacuum, and that the reader will be constantly watching for them automatically. I mean, if he is a good reader at all, for the meaning of every line, every action. He would constantly be on the lookout and meeting a new character. What makes him tick? He says this, why does he say it? That would be the approach of an alert reader. And I want you to see how much is read and implied between the lines. Now you remember the first scene between Rourke and Keating in the second chapter of Fountainhead. This is the first scene between two of the major characters, and therefore I selected this scene because it's at this stage that you are gathering, in effect, your first impressions of two major characters. You have already seen Rourke with the dean, and you have seen Peter Keating with his school graduation. But now you see the two of them together, and a certain scene takes place between them. That scene, just the dialogue, omitting the descriptions, and then I'll scene which I wrote for you today. I have rewritten this scene from the Fountainhead. This will be an unpublished scene from the Fountainhead, and I hope never to be published. And I wouldn't have done it for anyone else except in the interest of truth and literature. Now, I want you to watch. Try to think as nearly as you can that you don't know anything about the Fountainhead, that you're just reading it for the first time, and you might have a vague recollection of the first chapter. Now, this is the first time that you're reading a scene between two major characters. Try to project in your mind what impression you have of the two men. What do you learn about them and why? What is it in the scene that gave you that impression? And then we'll read another version of the same scene.
Congratulations, Peter, said Rourke. Oh, thanks. I mean, do you know? Or has Mother been telling you? She has. She shouldn't have. Why not? Look, Howard, you know that I'm terribly sorry about your being... Forget it. There's something I want to speak to you about, Howard, to ask your advice. Mind if I sit down? What is it? You won't think that it's awful of me to be asking about my business when you've just been... I said forget about that. What is it? You know, Howard, I've often thought that you're crazy. But I know that you know many things about it, architecture, I mean, which those fools never knew. And I know that you love it as they never will. Well, I don't know why I should come to you, but, Howard, I've never said it before, but you see, I'd rather have your opinion on things than the dean's. I'd probably follow the dean's, but it's just that yours means more to me myself. I don't know why. I don't know why I'm saying this either. Come on, said Rourke. You're not being afraid of me, are you? What do you want to ask about? It's about my scholarship, the Paris Prize I got. Yes? It's for 4 years. But on the other hand, Guy Francon offered me a job with him some time ago. Today he said it's still open, and I don't know which to take. If you want my advice, Peter, you've made a mistake already. By asking me, by asking anyone. Never ask people, not about your work. Don't you know what you want? How can you stand it not to know? You see, that's what I admire about you, Howard. You always know. Drop the compliments. But I mean it. How do you always manage to decide? Peter, how can you let others decide for you? But you see, Howard, I'm not sure. I'm never sure of myself. I don't know whether I'm as good as they all tell me I am. I wouldn't admit that to anyone but you. I think it's because you're always so sure that Then Mrs. Keating interrupts.
I won't discuss it now. Just make mental notes on anything that you have observed, what impression you have of the two characters. Try to solidify in your mind what impression you have. And if you remember what touches gave you the impression. Now we'll read another portion.
Congratulations, Peter, said Rourke. Oh, thanks. I mean, do you know? Or has Mother been telling you? She has. She shouldn't have. Oh, well, I didn't mind it. Look, Howard, you know that I'm terribly sorry about your being expelled. Thank you, Peter. There's something I want to speak to you about, Howard, to ask your advice. Mind if I sit down? Go right ahead. I'll be glad to help you if I can. You won't think that it's awful of me to be asking about my business when you've just been expelled? No, but it's nice of you to say that, Peter. I appreciate it. You know, Howard, I've often thought that you're crazy. Why? Well, the kind of ideas you have about architecture. There's nobody that's ever agreed with you, nobody of importance, not the dean, not any of the professors. And they know their business. They're always right. I don't know why I should come to you. Well, Peter, there are many different opinions in the world. What did you want to ask me? It's about my scholarship, the Paris Prize I got. Personally, said Rourke, personally, I wouldn't like it. But I know it's important to you. Keating said, it's for 4 years, but on the other hand, Guy Franchon offered me a job with him some time ago. Today he said it's still open, and I don't know which to take. If you want my advice, Peter, take the job with Guy Franchon. I don't care for his work, but he's a very prominent architect, and you'll learn how to build. You see, that's what I admire about you, Howard. You always know how to decide. I try my best. How do you do it? I guess I just do it. But you see, I'm not sure, Howard. I'm never sure of myself. You always are. Oh, I wouldn't say that, but I guess I'm sure about my work.
Is that a difference? But observe that the content is not changed. There's a slight change about Rourke at the end, but in fact, the meaning of the scene is exactly the same. And if you remember, Rourke actually later in the house does advise him to choose Franchon rather than the Paris Prize. But would you say that it's the same two characters talking? Yes?
Well, the content seems to me is changed in that Rourke now has a completely relativist point of view.
That's one of the things.
Isn't that a change in content as well as?
Well, not actually, because he's sure about his work.
I wouldn't say that.
You don't believe it. You don't believe it anymore.
Exactly.
He says
Exactly.
he is.
That's what I want you to observe, that you don't believe it, and you don't, and there's many other things that are changed, but the content in the sense of what the plot intention is, would be the same, only it's two different characters talking.
Yeah.
Particularly Rourke is changed. Now I will want you to analyze, and I'll show you the exact analysis of where the difference came and why. What I want you to think over now, and I think, is the means, the method of how great a change could be worked by very small changes. In fact, if you compare the two scenes, you can look at the written scene if you want to. Some, of course, are blatant changes, but they're comparatively minor. Yet the characterization is totally different, and that is what I want you to observe, how one projects characterization and why. Now, you notice that Rourke, first of all, is totally impervious to Keating's view of his expulsion. Keating's mother, or the conventional world. So much so he does not even conceive of a comparative standard. Now, if you notice, what would make Keating say that his mother should not have told Rourke of Keating's triumphs? Only the idea that Rourke would be hurt by the fact of Keating's triumph on the day of Rourke's expulsion. He would think that one would grate on the other. Rourke can't even conceive of it. not only he doesn't share the standard, but he doesn't even understand it at first. Because, observe, here's what goes on in the original scene. Has mother been telling you? She has. She shouldn't have. Why not? It's that why not that does more for Rourke's rejection of any sanction and for indicating the difference between his standards and Keating's than any other answer could have done. Because even if we don't pause to analyze it, the implication of that why not is a complete directness of a man who doesn't see any connection, who in effect is saying, what's your kind of triumph to me? My standards are totally different. But in the new scene, it goes like this. Has mother been telling you? She has. She shouldn't have. Oh, well, I didn't mind it. That immediately is an acceptance of the comparative standard, an acknowledgement that his expulsion is a disaster. Keating's kind of graduation is a triumph. Only Rourke is being generous about it and saying, well, it was cruel of your mother, but I didn't mind it. Do you see what the difference between these two lines does in relation to indicating the basic attitude or basic premises of a character? Now, if you approach this scene with the idea, Rourke is an independent man, Keating is a second-hander, but you didn't have it identified in your own mind any clearer than that, and you start writing, and you might not really know what would you have Rourke answer. And you might think, well, he's a strong man, so he will say, I didn't mind it. But that's where you have to watch your implication. That is what I mean, that characterization depends on the presentation of the basic premises or the motives of the character. You'd have to watch. If he says, I don't mind, what does that imply about his basic premises and his motivation? If he says, why not, it implies something entirely different. Now, you also observe that Rourke is rational and rationally courteous to Keating in his first scene, but he's totally indifferent. Not only he rejects the standards, but he doesn't show any interest in Keating's standards, no desire to discuss them, nor any particular desire to undertake this conversation, but he will listen if Keating has something to say. Observe this in the original scene. When Keating says, I'm terribly sorry about your being, and he doesn't quite dare say expelled. Rourke says, forget it. Because it's really nothing to him. He doesn't even care to explain to Keating. And then Keating asks, mind if I sit down? Rourke merely asks, what is it? Whereas in the second scene, he says, go right ahead. I'll be glad to help you. It immediately shows that he's friendly for no particular reason, because we have seen that their careers and standards are opposed. Yet here Rourke shows definite interest in Keating's problems and offers him to sit down. Now, if you wanted, if you had vaguely in mind the idea that Rourke should be courteous, there are different ways of presenting courtesy. In the scene I have written, the first one, Rourke is courteous, but completely consistently with the whole issue, with the difference of standards and with his attitude towards Keating. In the second scene, he is courteous beyond the line of politeness. He is actually interested. And that would be a contradiction, because the question then would arise, why is he, in view of their exactly opposite standards? Now, a very important point is the point at which Rourke in the original scene shows friendliness. If you remember the original scene, all of Rourke's answers are on the nature of why not, forget it, what is it? And he's listening, but he volunteers nothing. Now, then there is the first touch of friendliness. You remember when Keating suddenly feels as if someone had patted his hand, and Rourke is very friendly to him. Observe what that friendliness proceeds from. Here is Keating's speech. Well, I don't know why I should come to you, but Howard, I've never said it before, but you see, I'd rather have your opinion on things than the dean's. I probably follow the Dean's, but it's just that yours means more to me myself. I don't know why. I don't know why I'm saying this either. Now here Rourke can afford to be friendly for two reasons. First, this is a speech of profound respect for Rourke's standards. Keating has actually paid him a very high, very serious compliment. He has acknowledged the superiority of Rourke's standard, and he's shown sincerity. Then Rourke, in effect, can acknowledge that by rewarding it with a moment of friendliness, which amounts to saying, well, if this is how you feel, I can talk to you. And observe the generous form of it. He says, you're not being afraid of me, are you? And he knows that Keating is afraid of him, and by acknowledging it openly, he makes it easier for Keating. That was the most generous thing he could have done. Now observe the second scene. Now, he says, when Keating mentions the expulsion the second time, Rourke says, no, but it's nice of you to say that, Peter. I appreciate it. Now he shows friendliness in exchange for condolences. And by accepting it as nice, he subscribes to the fact that he is in a bad position, condolences are called for, and he in effect accepts Keating's charity. Not Keating's tribute and acknowledgement of his standards, but the opposite. Keating's condolences on the bad state to which his standards have brought him. So the friendliness here, although it's still friendliness, in this context acquires an entirely different meaning. Now you see somebody who is accepting charity instead of a generous man who is extending a helping hand when deserved. This is the kind of implications you have to watch for. Again, if your abstract intention approaching the scene was, well, I will show Rourke being friendly, if you don't concretize to yourself what that friendliness would be, if you don't integrate it with your view of the other premises of Rourke, you're going to get in that kind of contradiction, and you'll wonder why the character doesn't quite come across as you intended him. It's this kind of implication that you have to watch for. Now, then, of course, Keating says, you know, I've often thought that you're crazy. Now, that line I noticed everybody got. And Rourke asked why. That necessarily shows concern for Keating's opinion and perhaps even a certain amount of self-doubt. True that Rourke could have asked that defiantly or sarcastically if he had any reason to want to put Keating on the spot or make him argue. But the context of the scene is not that. Therefore, here Rourke is given a gratuitous insult and acknowledges and accepts it by saying, oh, you think I'm crazy? Why? Maybe I am. That is the implication. Now, observe that in the original scene, that line, I've often thought you're crazy, is in. But I used it here in order to show you what a context will do to a line. In the original scene, Keating says, you know, I've often thought that you're crazy, but I know that you know many things about it, architecture I mean, which those fools never knew. And I know that you love it as they never will. And when you say you're crazy with that kind of explanation, it's a great compliment. And even then, Rourke does not respond to the compliment. He merely says, well, he's not angry, but he doesn't encourage Keating to express his opinion. But what Keating is building up to is then the greater compliment of saying, I'd rather take your opinions and the Dean's. It means more to me. Now you see, here, watch the implications of the context. If Keating said, you're crazy, but you know more about architecture than anyone else, that's a tribute. If he just says, you know, I've often thought that you're crazy, Rourke should stop talking to him right then and there if he's the Rourke intended originally. Now observe the next one. When Keating finally asked his question in the original scene about which of the two roads he should take, and Rourke gives him advice about never take anyone's advice, observe that, first of all, this is the touch of real generosity, because he takes Keating's problem seriously. And he gives him advice, not about the concrete, but about the wider philosophical principle. He gives him the benefit of his own conviction. And he tells him this is an issue more serious than the choice of the two possibilities. Why do you ask anyone's advice? You shouldn't. Also, as brief characterization, this exchange between them in the original scene is probably my best touch of characterization that accomplishes more than any other line. Briefly, is the exchange of their two lines. When Keating says, "How do you always manage to decide?" and Rourke answers, "How can you let others decide for you?" Now, you see, those two lines really gave you the essence of the two characters. In the second scene, I dropped them. I wanted to pause here for a moment on these two lines of the original scene in order to show you how to integrate philosophical propaganda into fiction. And I'm looking at all those who had been slightly guilty in their assignments of not quite knowing how to do it. Now, this is such an issue as I always decide for myself, or I go by the opinions of others, is an extremely wide philosophical and basic issue. If you had two characters under a clear sky sitting and discussing it, that would be propaganda. In this scene, it's almost unnoticeable because it refers to the essence of the scene that is being enacted, so that it is an abstract principle applied to and illustrated by the concrete situation that's going on before your eyes. It is two men stating an abstract principle, but not stating it for the sake of a philosophical discussion, stating it as it applies to a practical reality and to their own problems. That's why it will be completely unnoticeable in the sense that it will be natural in this context. It applies only to their problems, yet it is much wider than the particular problem discussed. And that is the only way in which abstract principles should be used. That is, when you have the concrete illustration in the problems and the actions of the story, then you can afford to have a character state a very wide principle. But if the action doesn't support it, then that wide principle will stick out like a poster. Then it's artificial. And it's in this sense that I would say Galt's speech is not propaganda. Why? Because so many pages and words and so many events have gone to illustrate it that by the time he begins to talk about metaphysics and epistemology, the whole weight of the story is behind him as that to which his speech applies. If there had been just only part one, let us say, then that speech would be top-heavy. The proportion of how much abstract philosophy can you give without turning into a propagandist, that is, propagandist versus proper fiction writer, depends on how much of an event is this abstract philosophy covering. Here, if the issue in effect was second-handness versus independent individual creativeness, which is the theme of the whole book, I could not have had the two boys make more of a statement than what they did. That would have been too early. But for the purpose of what is being illustrated right in the scene, that one exchange of lines between them was enough. A speech like Galt's would have been too much for Rourke in his courtroom speech. The events of the story had not illustrated and presented that many issues. And the event of Atlas Shrugged did. Therefore, if you're ever in doubt about how long should a philosophical speech or comment be, always go by the standard how much or how detailed and complex are the events which I have offered to illustrate and concretize, and be guided by that. If the events are sufficiently illustrated to warrant a long statement, you can make as long a statement as you wish, and it will not take your reader outside the framework of the story. If the events are insufficient, then they will. Now, observe the details of the second scene. Now, did I make it to you, and this is only the general statement of what kind of characterization is achieved and by what means in the first scene? Do you see why I have illustrated all the things that I have just named about Rourke characters, such as independence of Keating's standards, generosity but politeness and indifference, and complete break with Keating's world. Now observe what kind of Rourke comes through the second scene. First, as I've mentioned, as you all mentioned, he accepts the standards of Keating and his mother. He accepts that his fate is disaster and Keating's fate is triumph, but he's going to be tolerant about it. He shows interest in Keating's fate and he shows eagerness to help him. He accepts Keating's condolences as if it's were charity. It's nice of you to say that. At Keating's comment on his ideas, he shows concern by asking why. An insulting comment, that is, when he says you're crazy. Now, of course, later in the scene, I've departed from the original Rourke quite blatantly. Because when he says, well, there are many opinions in the world, what does it imply about a character who will say that? That he has tolerant respect for all difference of opinions, that in effect, he is on the non-objective, non-absolute view of ideas, as contrasted to the such absolutism in the first scene that he doesn't even bother arguing about ideas with Keating. That the moment he knows, as he knows about Keating, that this is the enemy on the totally opposite premise, he's not going to discuss anything. Now that is a man who believes in absolutes. But a man who will say, well, there are many opinions in the world, you could say, well, but he is contemptuous. Someone might say that contemptuously or sarcastically in real life, but then you would have to indicate that it's contempt or sarcasm. The line as it stands, without any comment about how it's spoken, and in this context, only means not sarcasm or contempt, but direct tolerance. There are many opinions, so I'm different or I'm crazy. Now, what is your business? It's in effect completely minimizing his own standards, dismissing it and focusing only on Keating's problem. Then, when Keating asks his advice, Rourke in the second scene gives him specific advice. Now, what I want to call to your attention is that in the book originally, if you remember later, Rourke does give Keating just that advice. When Keating's mother is pressuring him to accept the Francon job, Rourke tells him, yes, it will be better, at least he will learn to build, which is consistent with Rourke's ideas. Therefore, it's consistent here when he tells him, go ahead and work for Francon. But observe the way I have him say. The first touch before that is, it's about my scholarship, the Paris Prize I got. And I have Rourke answer, personally I wouldn't like it, but I know it's important to you. Now that's true, that is the way Rourke's ideas do stand in the book. Only in the book, when he talks later about the Paris Prize, he says, what will drawing more palaces give you? Or Italian postcards, or some very contemptuous expression. Here, if he says, personally, I wouldn't care for it, that character-wise does not indicate strong contempt or strong assurance. It's just, again, tolerance and non-absolutism. Well, I wouldn't care, but to you it's important. And then Peter asks him about Francon, and Rourke answers, if you want my advice, Peter, take the job with Guy Francon. Gives him the advice straight. Now, here's what I want you to consider as technique. Later in the book, Rourke did give this advice. But again, it's an issue of watching what are the implications of a certain context. If Rourke were giving the advice here, when Keating originally asked him, he would, first of all, imply that there's nothing wrong in Keating asking that kind of an advice or going by another man's opinion. By giving him the kind of line I gave him in the original scene, which came rather unexpectedly. It's an arresting line. When you hear a man say, look, you've made a mistake by even asking my advice, you immediately focus on, you have the impression of a man who is saying something unconventional, surprising, and he backs it up. He gives his reason, and you see it's quite logical. You not only see the nature of Rourke's wider premises, but you also get the impression of a boy who is thinking, and who is thinking in much wider terms than any particular choice of a job. In the second case, in the second scene, if he advises Peter right here, it's just a matter of conventional acceptance of discussion among pals. That's one of the reasons why you might have had the impression that they're just two boys talking on the same terms. Incidentally, just to keep something clear, the reason, if you don't remember the details of the book, the reason why Rourke later gives him this advice, it's simply to end the conversation. It's grudgingly, contemptuously, and indifferently. Because by that time, Keating is on his second-hand premise. He's putting on an act for Rourke. The seriousness, the sincerity is gone. And Rourke merely dismisses him. But to give him advice here, in the context of a serious, sincere conversation, implies a totally different meaning and a totally different attitude on the part of Rourke. Now, the last change in that scene, of course, is quite obvious, and I've made it blatant so that you would see exactly how dialogue projects characterization. When Keating says, you always know how to decide, Rourke answers, I try my best. Now that is certainly the attitude of someone who is modest, to say the least, and that is completely uncharacteristic of Rourke. Again, if you were me in this sense, or if you had a problem like this in writing, and you're approaching the problem of how would I make a man talk whom I conceive of as independent, a rebel, and a man who is going to fight the whole world. And this is one of his first scenes in the book. And if he says, I try my best, you will give yourself such a handicap in characterization that I don't know how many heroic incidents would overcome it, if ever. Because there you see the blatant contradiction. If it's a strong man who relies only on his own judgment, he's never going to say a modest line like that. And the next one. Keating asks, how do you do it? I guess I just do it. For a man who later is going to be the apostle of reason and of the mind, you won't leave that line down as a contradiction. Yet, journalistically, you've heard it so many times that it's almost can pass unnoticed. That's the normal way of speaking for men on a normal, meaning average premises. But no heroic rebel is ever going to say, I guess I just do it, about his achievement, and most particularly not if he's the representative of rationality. And then he says, but you see, I'm not sure, Howard. I'm never sure of myself. You always are. Oh, I wouldn't say that, but I guess I'm sure about my work. Well, here I was slightly exaggerating and satirical in relation to Arrowsmith. But observe what that sort of does. What kind of characterization comes across from just that one line? Well, first, that Rourke does not hold self-confidence as an absolute virtue. He sees no wider principle. He sees no reason why he should be confident about anything except his work. Here, I wanted to indicate to you what kind of mistake you would make if you were intent only upon one aspect of your characterization. That is, you want to show that Rourke has great confidence and great integrity about his work. But you have this concept of a heroic architect. But you have not concretized or have not given enough thought to what kind of man would he be apart from architect. And the result of this would be that he becomes superficial and concrete bound in this sense, in the sense that Arrowsmith actually is. That he might have integrity if he says, here I have confidence about my work, or I'm sure about my work. It does indicate a man who might be a man of principles about his work, but has no wider idea of principles, no connection to any basic philosophical reasons or values. And what I would indicate here, or you would if you wrote that kind of thing, is somewhat, on a lesser degree, but nevertheless, to the extent of that scene, you would have accomplished the same thing as Arrowsmith, as Lewis did with Arrowsmith, which we discussed the last session. The fact that you yourself selected Arrowsmith as the least convincing character of the book. And you remember we discussed that he's somewhat out of focus. It doesn't seem to be a consistent characterization. And the main reason, of course, was that while he shows a certain kind of integrity or determination about his work, the way he behaves as a man, the kind of silly, superficial helplessness about romantic issues, personal issues, job selection, in fact, about everything except the laboratory. The difference between his two attitudes is so tremendous and left totally unexplained that the character does not integrate. When we say a character does not gel, we mean that the different evidence offered about him is never unified, neither into one whole nor even into a defined or comprehensible conflict. And by allowing Rourke such a line as, I don't know, I'm not always sure, but I am about my work, you immediately put him as a character in that kind of category. Here's a man who might have integrity professionally, but not otherwise. And for a naturalistic novel, as a one-layer answer, as one onion skin, that would be sufficient. All that we have shown is that for some unstated reason, he has great integrity about architecture. But it leaves totally open the wider questions of why about architecture and why is he as he is in other matters. Now, the reason Rourke came across as an integrated person is because whatever he says and does is totally internally consistent. Now observe this, that I know, and I've seen some of young writers influenced by me, I don't mean anyone present here, or it's not in the present tense, who would start writing a hero if they're influenced by Rourke, and they will take him as a monotone. That is, that he will only answer in very brief, snappy yes or no's, that he'll never show anything but a kind of a tight grimness, and he will always be on the fighting premise. Well, that would be too much of an abstraction. If you notice, just in this scene, and if you remember in the rest of the book, Rourke is not always only the man of integrity fighting everybody. He can be friendly and charming, he can be generous, he even has a few humorous lines, though I think only 2 in the whole book. But at least it's possible to him. You see all sorts of facets of him through the book. But why he comes as a monolith, why your impression of him would be as a man on only one line, is because whichever facet I show, it's always consistent with his basic premises. As an illustration, the example I mentioned in this first scene, that he can even be generous and friendly to Keating, but only in the context of Keating acknowledging his, Rourke's, artistic premises, not on any other basis. Whereas Arrowsmith is capable of such things as there are passages saying to himself, well, to hell with Gottlieb and science. I guess the commercial guys are pretty good. I guess I will be a doctor in a small town and make money, if you remember those passages. Because then it's shown that he can't really adjust to that, and he never forgives Gottlieb, and then he's drawn back to it. But in the meantime, the question left unanswered in Arrowsmith is, all right, we're presented with a man who is struggling, who has not yet decided whether he's going to devote himself to science or not. But the question that's never answered is, why is he struggling in that manner? Why is he constantly torn by the conventional and attracted to it, so the range of the moment, under the impetus of his engagement or his marriage or any immediate accidental personal problem. That is never explained in the whole book. You do not know why Arrowsmith had to be that kind of unstable element in everything except the laboratory. That is bad characterization. Now, I want to stress again that good characterization does not consist of making a character monotonous on a single line and sticking only to that line. In the sense that if you want to show Rourke as a fighter, all we'll know about him throughout the book is only his fighting aspect. That would be bad characterization in the sense of one quality or one aspect. Incomplete. You would necessarily have the impression, well, a man cannot be that way all the time. Nor can any man have one premise and no others. Therefore, it's not a matter of making your characters single attributed and monotonous. It's a matter of integrating every particular aspect to the total. And the focus of integration is the basic premises directing that character. Now, is this particular point clear? This is all I wanted to say about the principles to be learned from the two scenes. If you have other points, unless it's something relevant that you urgently want to mention now, I will continue, and then any smaller observations we can discuss in the question period. Has anyone anything particular to add to this scene? Well, if not, then I want to go to the next point, which is the question several of you asked me last time: how does one proceed to create a characterization? Now, that is a very difficult question in a way. Difficult only in this sense that, like everything else about writing, you cannot do it by conscious front-seat superstructure calculation. That is, you cannot do it by saying, in effect, I have no concept of what kind of character I want, but I'm going to make a list of all his top virtues. And each time I come to a line of dialogue, I'm going to check this list. For instance, if you had decided, using this Rourke-Keating scene as an example, that Rourke has to be independent, rational, determined, etc., just, honest, that's right, and all of the then unborn Galt's virtues. If you made a list of those virtues and decided this is what my man will have as his basic premises, now I'll put him to action. And all that you have in your mind is just that kind of semi-floating abstraction view of what those virtues are. You will never be able to make him utter one line of dialogue, because to begin with, no line of dialogue will occur to you. First, you won't be able to think of any line of dialogue. But supposing something occurred to you, you would have to spend practically a month trying to figure out, well, if Rourke says, why not? Does that check with the list? Or if instead he says, she shouldn't have, but I didn't mind it. How does that check with the list? In other words, you would not be able to sit and figure out by a conscious process the kind of considerations I was explaining to you here. It's too long, a list. And as I said, I only mentioned the blatant one, the kind of crucial points of difference between the two scenes. I could speak for 2 full lectures explaining to you the reasons, implications, and motivations of the lines, the characters in just these 2 scenes. It's as complex as that. Therefore, that is not the way by which you would approach characterization, and I want to warn you particularly those of you who are so anxious to write something about or on the basis of our philosophy. Don't approach your characters that way. Don't tell yourself, my hero is going to be independent, just, rational, etc. The process, like everything about writing, is indirect. That is, you have to know how to use your subconscious. You have to know how to set your subconscious machinery by a conscious process in such a way that when you need it, you can rely on it. it will make the right selections for you. Namely, here is an issue where a writer has to be a good rationalist, and only to the extent to which he is a good introspector would he be a good writer. By that I mean not every good writer has been a rationalist, but he has been a rationalist in relation to his writing, whether he knew it or not. Meaning this, your characterization will never be any better than your power of observation. You will not be able to create a character out of philosophical abstractions alone. Remember that the way human epistemology works is that you do not first conceive of floating abstractions in some kind of Platonic way, and then by means of them learn to recognize the concrete, which, as you know, would be Plato's view of epistemology. Human epistemology works by the Aristotelian method. That is, before you can properly get an abstraction, before you can know that you really know it, you had to derive it from concretes. Therefore, the way to prepare your subconscious for writing proper characterization is to be a good introspector and a good observer. Namely, good introspector in this sense: you are constantly reacting to people. You are constantly approving or disapproving, liking someone or disliking, being uneasy or encouraged. You're constantly estimating emotionally everyone you meet. Now learn to be an introspector in the sense of accounting to yourself, as briefly or as detailedly as you care to, what about that person caused your reaction. Don't go through life saying, I don't like so-and-so. Why? How do I know? I just don't like him. That will never make you a writer. But if you feel a strong dislike for someone, pause as your artistic assignment to yourself. It's not only a philosophical assignment, but it's an artistic assignment. I mean, here is where the moral and the practical are one. Identify what is it that you don't like and by what means did you observe this. For instance, someone is rude to you, let us say. You don't like it. That's perfectly rational. Observe. What was rude about it? Was it the implication of what the man said? Was it his voice or manner? How did you perceive that he is rude? And if you dislike it, why do you dislike it? Then file it in your subconscious that way. Another time you might see someone who is very charming. Don't say to yourself, oh, it's wonderful, I like this person. I don't know why, but I like him. No, do the same thing. Observe, oh, this person is charming, why? What was charming about him? How did he convey it? How did you observe it? Store that. If you are a constant conscious valuer of people, that is the material from which you will draw your characterization when you want it. And since all of you today have more abstractions, more philosophical information than your own concrete experience has yet supported, that is, that you have learned a great many philosophical abstractions and have not had much time, simply a matter of years, to connect them to concretes, do the reverse process. If you think that you like independence, observe in people. Whom do you classify as independent and why? What line or gesture or manner of someone conveys independence to you? And conversely, what conveys dependence or uncertainty? What conveys honesty? What conveys dishonesty? You can only observe it by the outward material, physical manifestations of another person. By words, actions, gestures, and all the subtler mannerisms of a personality. Learn to observe that. Now, if you have stocked your subconscious with that kind of well-filed material, that is, when your concretes are all filed on the proper abstractions, and your abstractions are not floating in your mind, but have a great many concretes to illustrate them, then you approach an assignment such as present a characterization of Rourke. If you tell yourself He's an independent man, and a rationalist and honest and just. Your subconscious will throw at you the kind of concrete where you will feel instinctively without thinking while writing this scene. Yes, Rourke would say that, but he would not say this. When you write dialogue, you actually write it as if you're listening to a dictation. You write it inspirationally. At least the best, most natural dialogue is usually written that way. Now you might get stuck on any particular point and might have to question yourself. But normally, I find, and as far as I know, it so is most writers whom I've asked, when you come to writing dialogue, it writes itself. You have a concept of the scene, and when you sit down to write, it just, in effect, just comes to you. In the same way that if I was speaking to you, your own answer would come to you. That is, you would be speaking from your premises, from your knowledge, or from your estimate of the situation. What you do in writing a scene where characterizations are involved, which means, of course, any dialogue scene, you have to be able to react on two or more premises. You have to be able to be very clear that as Rourke, you speak from a certain premise. As Keating, you say something else. As Mrs. Keating, a somewhat different angle. But you have to have your mind so trained to the connection between certain basic abstractions and their concrete expressions that you can be your own actor and reactor in a dialogue scene. You can write for 3 or 5 or any number of people, constantly switching basic premises in your mind. You don't do it by order. If you have to remind yourself, you're not yet ready, because you can't do it by conscious intention. What you have to reach is the stage where it feels to you as if it's instinctive. As if the moment you speak for Rourke, you have a sense of what that character would do. And now Keating has to answer, and you have a sense of what he would answer, etc. But this is the kind of process that makes bad introspective writers or writers who might have followed a perfectly rational procedure about literature, but not about any other aspect of their life. This is what makes them say that writing is non-rational, and that it cannot be learned, and that you're driven by instinct or emotion, and that you just feel it or you don't, and who can dispute about talent? I mean, it's that kind of process that makes not only writers, but artists in all lines claim that art is emotional and inspirational and it can never be learned. This is what has made art the special province, the reservation of the mystics. But there's nothing mystical about it, no more than about your emotions. You know in which way you cannot will an emotion directly, because the emotion itself is an automatic product of your conscience, but you can will the premises behind that emotion. You can will to think and identify your premises. In the same way, the same rule applies to writing and specifically to characterization in writing. Even more so and more complexly in the question of style, which will be our next topic. But in characterization, you cannot will to write a characterization directly by front-seat method if you know nothing else than learned set of principles and have made no observations, no integration to concrete on your own. That you cannot do. But that inspiration, that sudden feel of a character, or the knowledge, well, I just know that Rourke would say this, and I just know that Keating would not say that, but would say something else, that is not a mystical tone nor a mystical feeling. In the process of writing, it feels to you as if you just know. All that this feeling means is that your understanding of the process of characterization has become automatic. That you don't have to stop and tell yourself the whole list of Rourke's motives. It's so well integrated that you know what to make him say. When I wrote this scene or any scene, I did not go through the kind of process that I'm explaining to you in these notes on what each line implies and why a different line would have a different meaning. I didn't think of that consciously at all. But the point is that when I write a line, and I write it, let us say, inspirationally, I can tell myself why this line is in character with Rolf and another line will be out of character. It's that kind of process that you have to achieve, namely, the confidence in your own, quote, instinct, meaning in those observations and premises which have become automatic so that you can write instinctively, so that you can trust your subconscious to throw you the right combination, the right actions and words. But to be in control of it and to know whether what you have written is objectively valid or not, you have to be able, after you have written it, to tell yourself why this was the right line for this character and what it conveys, and why something else was right for another character and what that conveys. You have to be able to go through the kind of analysis I did here today. As I said, it's not necessary for you to do that every time you write something, but that is what you will have to do at first in order to train yourself to the process, after which you won't have to account for yourself each time. You will just know that it's right. Only when I say just know, I don't mean what the mystics mean. I mean that you will have all your rational justification in order and available to your mind. Only it won't be necessary for you to check them every time. You will know by that lightning sum what kind of touch was right and why it was right. Now, as I said, if you want to train yourself in the art of characterization, start by observing and identifying in the way I mentioned. And when you begin writing, try to write only as much as you're sure of, and as much as feels right to you. Don't try to force your characters into artificial kind of behavior, which we have observed in some of the first assignments read here. Don't try to force them just because the philosophy demands it. If you do not quite know what a character would do, that simply means that you have to give it some more thought. But not that you're going to arbitrarily say, well, here he's going to make a speech about independence. Or, I don't know what he's going to say, so I'll just put the first line available. It's a neutral line, I'll get away with it. Don't ever do that. Now, as a technical assistance, I mean, this is just a method which I personally have found helpful. I don't know whether every writer does it, although I know many who do. But what I don't know is whether it's necessarily the method or the only one to help you with characterization. I find this helpful. If I want to create a certain kind of character, I will project him visually, if that is my only lead, so that I can see the appearance, and that gives me a concrete focus, so that the character does not float in my mind as a kind of collection of abstract virtues, but that I would first see what does he look like. Then it's almost like a physical body on which I can then hang the abstractions. That is the way Rourke was created, for instance. I never based him on any human being as such, but the start of the character was the concept of the red-headed man with the long legs and the gaunt cheekbones, which had always been my ideal anyway. I don't mean the red hair, I mean the long legs and gaunt cheekbones, which you can recognize in any of my heroes. But I had to have a concept as clear as I can visually project of the figure of the man. And that became the focus for all the abstract considerations, that all the characteristics that this man had to have. Now, in the case, and this is true of all my heroes, in the case of villains or intermediate characters who are not particularly neither too good nor too bad, but have to be specific characterizations, what I find very helpful is to focus on some person I know or some public figure, not in the concrete sense, not in the sense of thinking of any details, but only of the essence. That is what I mean by drawing an abstraction for a person. For instance, I'll tell you how the character of Tui was created. Now there I had 4 actual living people in mind, mainly journalists and politicians and such. And I never thought of any one of them in specific detail, nor did I study their writings or their actions or lives. It merely is that my total impression of their kind of action or writing gave me a certain clue to a certain basic premise or attribute of the man. And I had very clearly in mind that Tui would represent certain kind of philosophies. As concrete, to hold it in my mind, I had these 4 different figures. That was just the preliminary gathering of material. Well, then one day, some liberal friends of mine, or rather acquaintances, invited me to a lecture by a liberal at the New School of Social Research, incidentally. And I felt that it would be totally immoral to go. But they insisted that he really was not leftist, and it was very objective and a brilliant speaker, and would I please go, and they had bought the tickets, so Frank and I went. Now I won't tell you who it was, but there was Tui in the flesh. The personal appearance and the manner, but most particularly the manner, what that man projected when he spoke was infinitely more than the specific content of his ideas. It's true that he was not particularly liberal, that is, he was the most vicious liberal I have ever heard in public, only he wasn't blatantly so. He was very subtle and very gracious, and he rambled a great deal about nothing in particular, and then he made crucial points once in a while, and those foolish acquaintances of mine did not know what was going on, but I knew. And I thought, now there was my character. I never read anything about him, because that would have been journalistic writing. I didn't care to know much. All that I got was that appearance of the man on the speaker's pulpit and the way he spoke. Now, what did I gain from him? Just the concretization, that total, that lightning-like sum of what kind of personality certain premises would produce. Now, I compromised with the cause sufficiently, and as a matter of fact, I think that was done for the cause and the best investment. Against any former reluctance, the next time he came to New York, he was a foreign speaker. I paid $2 for 2 tickets for Frank and me to hear him again of my own free choice. But he served his purpose against the liberal cause. What he gave me, you see, was this. Any time I tried to ask myself, how would we act towards Katie, for instance, or to any personal issue, all I had to do was remember the picture of that man on the speaker's pulpit. Now, you see, that's using an abstraction. It's not using it concrete. From a political lecture, or 2, in fact, that I heard, I had no way of knowing what his attitude would be towards a niece, or if he ever had a niece, or what he would do about young love, or what he would do about Dominic and Wynand. That is the naturalistic method. If I had to go by those details, that would be copying an actual model. That's not what I did. All I had to do is to project the concrete impression of that figure with everything it implied, and I would know unerringly just what that type of man would do. Years later, I found out that in fact his career was somewhat like Tui's, that he was always the man behind the scenes, much more intellectual and influential than anybody knew publicly. He was always pulling strings behind governments of several countries, was in on all conspiracies. In fact, finally was proved to be a communist, which he certainly publicly did not announce himself as and didn't blatantly sound as. But now that was my writer's instinct, in quote. That was my method of gathering characterization. I observed the total impression of that man, and I derived my own concretes, and in many instances, they were very similar to the facts, proving not that I was clairvoyant, but that I had grasped the right abstractions and translated them correctly. So that is the method I would recommend, but as I say, not as an absolute. If it seems too cumbersome, don't try it as a duty. Other writers do just that. You don't literally copy a person. You use a person as a concretization of something too complex to hold in your mind as just a philosophical or literary description. That kind of idea of a character who projects the essence of the qualities you want serves to concretize your own abstractions in your mind and to anchor them specifically, so that when you come to putting him into an action or a dialogue scene, you have a sense of the kind of thing he would say without having to figure it all out in advance. You have caught the basic tone, the key of that person. Now that, in effect, will conclude our lecture on characterization, and next time we'll try style.